Some of the greatest innovators of the modernist literary and artistic movement emerged out of the Harlem community in New York in the 1920s and 30s. This week we're reading Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, so I want to talk a little bit about the context in which they made their mark. First of all, we have to go back again one more time to the 19th century, to Reconstruction and Jim Crow. As you know, following the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th constitutional amendments technically guaranteed freedom, citizenship, and voting rights for Black people, and in the case of voting, specifically only for Black men. The other thing that we saw in the 19th century following slavery was expanding literacy and education among Black Americans. Schools opened up for Black children all over the country. There was an emphasis among a rising number of Black intellectuals on really sort of boosting the Black community, bringing people up from slavery to full participation in the country. Alongside that, of course, you had the dark side. Jim Crow laws are the most famous, laws enforcing segregation and trying to keep Black people from participating politically, especially from voting. Jim Crow laws, especially in the South, were often enforced using lynching and other acts of violence. The other important context is starting in the early 20th century, large-scale migration from the rural South to the North and the West by African Americans, particularly because of industrialization. Because there were fewer and fewer agricultural opportunities, it was really uncertain. Black people were often working as sharecroppers, making very little money. It seemed to look a lot like slavery. But because of industrialization, northern areas had factories where you could work. They had businesses. There were opportunities for education that weren't available in rural areas. The other thing that we saw in the 20th century was increasing numbers of Black Caribbean immigrants. So what's interesting about that is that it creates conditions that are ripe for art. The other thing, of course, though, is that Black people are experiencing different kinds of racism and racial inequality as they move around the country. Racial prejudice looks really different in New York City from how it looks in rural Alabama. But it's not that it stops existing, right? It's just that it sort of changes shape. The Harlem Renaissance is the proliferation of Black art, literature, music, and intellectual life in Harlem. The other thing that's important about the Harlem Renaissance is not so much that there were never Black artists before, but that all of a sudden the Black arts are mainstream. White people are attending musical performances by Black artists. They're reading poetry by Blacks. And patrons are supporting those efforts financially. The most famous example of this is the blues and jazz, two musical movements that are closely related. Many musicians practice sort of hybrid forms of blues and jazz. These musical forms emerged from the Black community, but they were hugely popular all over the country, and white people were going. Blues and jazz were integral to the sort of culture of the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, and they are still known as the most famous American musical forms, maybe the only uniquely American musical forms. The other interesting thing to think about is the primitivist movement as a sort of subset of modernist art. Many Black artists celebrated authentic or essential Black culture in contrast to what they saw as the decay, the corruption, and the confusion of urban modernity. So you'll notice actually a nod to primitivism in The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. So with that, we will move on to our specific writers.